Sophia Carter had spent years perfecting the art of control. Control over her empire, control over her image, control over every carefully curated aspect of her life. But nothing prepared her for the moment she lost it. The moment she saw him again. Ethan Hayes, the first man to make her feel alive. The only man who had ever truly mattered, and now he was standing behind a small street food cart, gripping a pair of metal tongs, effortlessly turning sizzling skewers over an open flame. The scent of grilled meat and smoky charcoal filled the air, but it wasn't the heat from the fire that made her skin burn. It was him. Sophia's breath caught. The years had sculpted him into something even more devastating. Broader shoulders, thick forearms, his plain t-shirt clinging to a strong-toned chest. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and a shadow of scruff covered his defined jaw. But it was his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. Those deep, unreadable eyes that locked onto hers the moment he saw her. A flicker of something passed through. Then shock, nostalgia, something darker. But it vanished just as quickly. Instead of acknowledging her, Ethan simply turned another skewer on the grill and focused on his work, as if she were just another customer. Sophia felt a strange mix of irritation and excitement coil in her stomach. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her closer to the cart. The closer she got, the more her pulse quickened. She was too aware of him, the way his muscles tensed as he worked, the roughness of his hands as he reached for the skewer, the slight flex of his forearm as he held it out to her. Damn him, she took the skewer, her fingers barely grazing his, and felt it. That same electricity that once set her on fire. Ethan finally met her gaze, his voice low and controlled. Didn't expect to see Sophia Carter eating street food. His tone was unreadable, but there was an edge to it. Sophia lifted her chin slightly, refusing to let him get the upper hand. I still appreciate real food. His lips curved just a little. Good to know. She bit into the skewer, the smoky, seasoned flavor bursting on her tongue. But she barely tasted it, not when Ethan was watching her like that. Like he knew, like he was daring her to remember. She swallowed, keeping her composure. Still good at what you do? Ethan let out a soft chuckle, the sound sending a heat wave straight through her. You have no idea. The words were laced with something dangerous, something that made Sophia's thighs press together instinctively. The heat between them was unmistakable, and she wasn't sure she wanted to control it anymore. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, dark and intense, as if he were trying to peel away every layer of composure she wore like armor. Sophia refused to flinch under his scrutiny, but the heat pooling low in her stomach betrayed her. She wasn't prepared for him, not like this. His rough hands moved with precision, flipping another skewer over the fire. The way his muscles flexed, with each movement, made her thighs press together involuntarily. The scent of grilled meat mixed with the faint musk of his sweat, an intoxicating combination that made her pulse quicken. Damn him. He was effortless in his masculinity, unaware, or perhaps completely aware, of how devastatingly magnetic he was. The skewer in her hand felt heavier than it should. She took another slow bite, her lips parting around the piece of meat, the juices dripping slightly onto her tongue. She flicked her gaze back to Ethan, catching the way his eyes dropped just for a fraction of a second, before flicking back to hers. She saw it. The hunger. It was there, buried beneath his practiced indifference. Sophia swallowed, letting her tongue sweep across her lips, savoring the lingering taste. And she knew he was watching. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if trying to snap out of whatever trance she'd pulled him into. You still play games, don't you? His voice was low, rough, like sandpaper against her skin. Sophia tilted, her head feigning innocence. I don't know what you're talking about, Ethan smirked, the movement slow, deliberate. His fingers tightened slightly around the metal tongs he held, knuckles flexing, jaw tensing, like he was holding back more than just his words. Right. And I'm supposed to believe you standing here, eating like that, looking at me like that. Means nothing? A slow, knowing smile curled at the corner of Sophia's lips. I don't remember you being so paranoid, Ethan chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. His eyes remained locked onto hers, unwavering. "And I don't remember you being this obvious." Sophia's breath hitched slightly, because for all her confidence, all her experience in keeping men at arm's length, Ethan wasn't just any man. He was the only one who had ever made her lose control, and he was doing it again. The tension between them was suffocating, thick with everything unspoken, with everything unresolved. Ethan finally broke the silence, but not before his eyes swept down her body, so slow, so measured, she felt it. "You're playing with fire, Sophia." She stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating off him, could see the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Maybe I want to get burned for..." The first time, Ethan looked shaken, just for a second, but she saw it and she wasn't about to let him forget it. The tension was a living thing between them, pulsing, thick, suffocating in the best way possible. Sophia could feel Ethan's heat even though he wasn't touching her. Yet his jaw was tight, his breathing steady but just slightly deeper than before, betraying the restraint he was barely holding onto. She stepped even closer. The space between them shrank to nothing, and now she could see every detail of him. The faint sheen of sweat on his skin from standing near the grill, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his lips parted just slightly when she got too close. Ethan held his ground, but his grip on the metal tongs tightened. "You really want to do this?" he murmured, voice low, rough, the kind that vibrated through her skin. Sophia tilted her head, her fingers tracing an invisible path along the counter of his food cart, her movements slow, deliberate. "Do what?" Ethan exhaled sharply, his gaze dropping for just a second, to her lips, then lower. Her dress hugged her body in all the right places, the thin straps leaving her shoulders bare, exposing the delicate line of her collarbone. She saw his fingers twitch, as if resisting the urge to reach out. She wanted him to reach out. She wanted to feel his hands on her again, rough, sure, claiming. But she also wanted to make him break first. Sophia licked her lips, watching the way. Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Say it," he demanded, voice quieter now but somehow heavier. She raised an eyebrow, keeping her expression neutral, though her pulse was anything but steady. "Say what?" Ethan exhaled, his patience fraying. "That you still think about me." Her breath hitched because for all her teasing, for all the control she thought she had, he knew. He could see it in her eyes. The truth was, Ethan never left her mind. She had spent years pretending he was just a memory, something distant, something she had outgrown. But now, standing this close, the heat of his body licking at her skin, the scent of him, smoke, salt, something undeniably masculine, she knew. She was still his, just as much as he had always been hers, but she wouldn't give in so easily. Not yet. Instead of answering, Sophia let her fingers trail over the edge of his apron, her nails grazing against the fabric. His entire body tensed. His breath came sharper, nostrils flaring, his control slipping. She tilted her face up close enough that her lips almost brushed his jaw. "Why don't you tell me what you think, Ethan?" His hands finally moved. One gripped the counter, the other reached for her waist, hot, firm fingers pressing into her hip, pulling her just a fraction closer. The world around them didn't exist anymore. Just heat, just breath, just the way. His grip tightened when she shifted slightly, pressing her body against his. She heard his breathing change, felt the hardness of him through his jeans. A thrill shot down her spine, pooling deep in her core. Ethan lowered his head until his lips barely brushed her ear. "You like playing games, Sophia." His voice was pure sin. Sophia smirked, even as her body begged for him. "And you like pretending you don't want to play too." Ethan's grip on her hip tightened. Game on. The first raindrop hit the pavement with a soft hiss, then another. Within seconds, the sky opened up, and warm, summer rain poured over the city, drenching the streets in a humid electric mist. Sophia should have left. She should have walked away before she lost herself completely in Ethan again. But instead she stood there, rooted to the spot, as if gravity itself had tethered her to him. Ethan exhaled sharply, glancing up at the sky before shaking his head with a low chuckle. "Looks like you're stuck here." Sophia smirked, tilting her chin up defiantly. And what if I like being stuck? His gaze darkened. Challenge accepted. The rain poured harder, drenching them both in seconds. Her thin dress clung to her body, outlining every curve, every dip, and judging by the way Ethan's jaw flexed, he noticed. His shirt was already soaked, the fabric molding to his broad chest, beads of water dripping from his hair down his neck, disappearing beneath the collar. She wanted to follow those drops. Ethan grabbed a rag and tossed it over his cart before turning to her again. "Come on, I'll walk you to your car." Sophia hesitated, her body still pulsing from their earlier exchange. Being in an enclosed space with him, alone, was dangerous. But she wanted dangerous. She nodded, and together they walked quickly through the storm, the rain soaking into their skin. By the time they reached her sleek black car, she was breathless, not from the run but from the awareness thrumming between them. She pressed the key fob, unlocking the door. Ethan hesitated. He was drenched, his hair a mess, his shirt sticking to every defined muscle of his torso. And yet, even standing there, soaked and disheveled, he had never looked more tempting. Sophia swallowed hard. "Do you need a ride?" Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly, like he knew exactly what would happen if he got in that car with her. She didn't give him time to answer. She just opened the door. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, Ethan stepped forward, sliding into the passenger seat with deliberate slowness. The door shut. The rain pounded against the roof, enclosing them in their own little world. Silence. Thick. Stifling. Sophia's hands gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She could feel the heat of his presence, the way his breath was just slightly uneven. Then, Ethan did something that made her stomach tighten. He reached over and touched her thigh, not high enough to be indecent, not low enough to be casual, just enough. Sophia sucked in a sharp breath, her pulse hammering as his fingers stayed there, warm, firm, teasing. Ethan leaned in, his voice a slow, dark whisper against her ear. "You should start the car, Sophia." She turned her head just a fraction, their faces now inches apart. "And if I don't?" His fingers flexed slightly on her thigh. His lips curled, a slow, devastating smirk. "Then I guess we see what happens." Sophia felt her restraint snap. She wasn't going to drive anywhere tonight. The rain pounded against the windshield, the rhythmic drumming filling the silence between them. But inside the car the air was thick, dense with everything unspoken. Sophia's breath came short, her chest rising and falling beneath the soaked fabric of her dress. Ethan's hand was still there, warm, firm, possessive, resting on her thigh like he had every right to touch her, and she let him. No, she wanted him to. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned toward him, their faces so close now that she could see the droplets of water clinging to his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly, his breath shallow. Her gaze flicked to his mouth. And that was it. The last thread of resistance snapped. She didn't care about consequences. Didn't care about the past, the pain, the years between them. She only cared about this moment. Sophia grabbed the front of his wet shirt and pulled him toward her. Their lips collided in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was raw, desperate. A clash of tongues and teeth and years of longing compressed into one feverish moment. Ethan groaned into her mouth, his hands tightening on her, gripping her waist and yanking her into his lap as if he couldn't bear another second of distance. The moment she straddled him, she felt him, hard, ready. A fire erupted in her core and she rolled her hips against him instinctively, her dress riding up, exposing the smooth skin of her thighs. Ethan's fingers dug into her waist as he pulled her closer, his own control, slipping. "Fuck, Sophia," he rasped against her lips. The sound of her name on his tongue, broken and rough, sent a shockwave straight through her. She kissed him harder, deeper. Her hands explored, sliding up his drenched shirt, feeling the solid, defined muscles of his abdomen. His skin was hot, even through the damp chill of the rain. And when her nails raked lightly over his torso, he shuddered beneath her touch. Ethan gripped her hair, tilting her head back, his mouth trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down the delicate column of her throat. Sophia gasped, arching into him. Everything was heat and friction, every touch, every movement building, intensifying. She ground against him, feeling the unbearable ache between her legs grow sharper, needier. "This is a bad idea," Ethan groaned against her skin, but his grip on her only tightened. Sophia smirked, breathless, her fingers still tangled in his wet hair. "Then stop me." His response was instant. Ethan flipped her, pinning her against the car seat, his body pressing into hers, his mouth crashing. Against hers again, hungry, ravenous. The rain outside blurred the world around them, but inside the car it was fire and chaos. Sophia wasn't stopping, and neither was he. Every breath Sophia took felt heavy. Every inch of her skin still burned from Ethan's touch. She could still feel the imprint of his hands on her body, the bruising grip of his fingers on her hips. But the moment was gone. Ethan had pulled away. Too fast, too suddenly. Now he sat in the passenger seat, his breathing uneven, his jaw clenched. His hands were still fisted at his sides, as if he was fighting the urge to grab her again. Sophia's body screamed for him, for the heat of his mouth against her skin, for the way he had devoured her as if she was the only thing that existed. But his eyes told a different story. A storm brewed there, something darker than desire, something bitter, something painful. Sophia swallowed hard, shifting slightly in her seat, trying to steady herself. "You're shutting down, Ethan." He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his rain-dampened hair. "This shouldn't be happening." A sharp laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. "And yet it is." Ethan turned to face her then, his expression unreadable. But his body betrayed him, the tension in his muscles, the way his breath still came in short, ragged pulls, the way his knuckles were white from how tightly he was gripping his own thighs. He still wanted her. Sophia leaned closer, her hand reaching out, fingers ghosting over his forearm. His skin was warm beneath her touch, too warm, and when she dragged, her nails lightly over his forearm, he shuddered. "Talk to me, Ethan." His jaw flexed. "There's nothing to talk about." She studied him for a long moment before leaning back, crossing her arms. Bullshit. His gaze snapped to hers, sharp, dangerous. "You want to know the truth, Sophia?" His voice was low, rough, not from desire this time, but from something deeper. Sophia's heart pounded. "Tell me." Ethan exhaled, his hands gripping his thighs even harder. "Your family ruined mine." The words hit like a slap. For a moment she thought she misheard him, but the bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. Sophia's breath caught. "What?" Ethan's gaze was unreadable now, a mask slipping over his features. "Your father made sure my family was destroyed. You were too wrapped up in your perfect life to notice, but while you were off living your dream, I was dealing with the aftermath of your family's decisions." Sophia felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, because deep down, in a place she had never dared to explore, she already knew. She had just never wanted to see it. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Still feel like playing with fire, Sophia?" But the fire between them had already consumed her, and now she wasn't sure if there was a way to survive the burn. Sophia sat frozen, the weight of Ethan's words pressing into her chest like a crushing force. The heat between them hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified, sharpened by the bitterness that now coiled in his voice. Her father had ruined his life. And yet, he still wanted her. And she still craved him. The contradiction was intoxicating, dangerous and utterly inescapable. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to clear the haze between them. "I should walk away from this." His voice was rough, strained, as if he was trying to convince himself rather than her. Sophia's pulse thundered, her entire body aching from the kiss they had abandoned, from the way his hands had explored her moments ago, igniting every nerve ending. She should let him leave. She should end this before it destroys them both, but she had never been good at doing the right thing, so instead, she reached out, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt, tugging him closer, closing the last remaining inches between them. "Then go." Her voice was steady, but her body betrayed her, chest rising and falling rapidly, lips still swollen from his kiss. Ethan's breath hitched, his jaw clenched, his restraint snapping like a live wire. And then he broke. In a blur, he grabbed her, his hands rough as they tangled in her hair, pulling her into a devastating kiss. It was desperate, violent, raw. A clash of mouths and tongues, a war of teeth and lips, a battle of need and rage. Sophia gasped against his mouth as he pressed her back against the seat, his weight deliciously overwhelming, his hands already pushing her dress higher, exposing the silky skin of her thighs. Ethan's fingers slid beneath the fabric, claiming, teasing, exploring, his touch setting her nerves on fire. "Fuck, Sophia," he groaned, voice thick, almost painful. She arched into him, nails dragging down his bare back, reveling in the way his muscles tensed beneath her touch. His hands gripped her hips, guiding her movements against him, the friction making her pulse with need. The air was humid, heavy with heat, with the scent of rain and sweat and something undeniably primal. Every roll of her hips against his scent, shocks of pleasure coursing through her, her body already trembling, already on the edge. Ethan's grip tightened, his breath ragged. "You're playing a dangerous game." Sophia met his gaze, eyes wild, unafraid. "So play it with me." A low growl rumbled from his chest, and then he gave in completely. The storm outside had nothing on them. Because inside that car they were the hurricane, and neither of them wanted to survive the wreckage. The air inside the car was thick, humid, intoxicating, charged with something untamed. Sophia's body still pulsed, still ached from the way Ethan had touched her, from the way he had claimed her like she was the only thing that mattered. But now reality crept in. Ethan sat beside her, his shirt half open, his breathing still unsteady, his knuckles flexing as if he was fighting the urge to pull her back into his arms. But he didn't. He was retreating. Sophia could feel it. The way his body tensed, the way his gaze darkened, no longer filled with just desire but with something sharper. She turned toward him, her fingers still tingling from where they had raked down his back. "Don't do that." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw before looking at her. "Do what?" "Pull away. Pretend this doesn't mean something." His eyes flashed, something dangerous brewing there. "It doesn't change the past, Sophia." Her heart clenched. She knew that. She knew what stood between them, but she also knew that what just happened wasn't just sex. It was years of longing, years of denial, finally unleashed. She reached for him, her fingertips grazing his forearm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. "We're not those people anymore, Ethan. We don't have to let the past decide this." His jaw tightened. "The world won't see it that way." A sharp vibration broke the silence. Sophia glanced at her phone on the console, her assistant's name flashing across the screen. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed it, hesitating before answering. "What is it?" The voice on the other end was tight, urgent. "There's a story being leaked to the press. Someone saw you last night, with him." Sophia's stomach dropped. She felt Ethan watching her, his posture suddenly rigid, as if he already knew what she was hearing. "Who leaked it?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. Her assistant hesitated. "We don't know yet, but the board is already asking for an explanation." Sophia closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the world slamming back onto her shoulders. She had spent years building her reputation, maintaining control over every aspect of her life. But now everything was slipping through her fingers, and the worst part? She didn't regret a damn thing. She ended the call and looked at Ethan. His gaze was unreadable, but his body language screamed what he wasn't saying aloud. He was bracing for impact, because he had been here before. Because last time, when their worlds collided, he was the one left in ruins. Sophia reached for him again, her touch gentler now, her voice softer. "I can fix this." Ethan let out a sharp breath, his control slipping just slightly as he looked at her. "And if you can't?" She held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. "Then I fight." Something flickered in his expression, something almost hopeful, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Ethan leaned in, so close she could feel the heat of his breath against her lips. "Then fight, Sophia. a challenge, a warning, a promise, and she never backed down from a fight. Sophia had always been good at handling pressure. She built an empire on resilience, on the ability to manipulate a crisis in her favor. But this was different. This wasn't a hostile takeover or a corporate scandal. This was Ethan, and for the first time she didn't know how to fix this. The weight of the leaked story pressed down on her, but the real weight, the one pressing into her ribs, making it hard to breathe, was the look in his eyes. He had been here before, and it had nearly destroyed him. Sophia opened her mouth, but Ethan spoke first. "You think you can fight this? You think you can protect me from people like your father?" She flinched, because that name, her father, wasn't just a word between them. It was a wound. She squared her shoulders, trying to hold her ground. "I don't expect you to trust me, Ethan, but I'm not my father." Ethan let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "No? Then tell me, Sophia, how long did it take before you found out? What he did? Before you realized the people you grew up with weren't as clean as you wanted to believe?" Her silence was answer enough. Ethan took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, his body radiating heat and frustration. "While you were being groomed to take over the Carter Empire, I was watching everything my family built burn to the ground." Sophia clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "I didn't know, Ethan." His jaw flexed, his hands forming tight fists at his sides. "But you do now." The air between them was electric, the same tension that had ignited their bodies now coiling into something heavier, something more dangerous. Sophia refused to break. She stepped into his space, forcing him to feel her presence, forcing him to see her. "And what do you want me to do with that? Walk away? Pretend this thing between us doesn't exist?" Ethan exhaled sharply, his gaze flicking down to her lips, his control cracking. "You're asking me to trust the same world that buried me, Sophia." She reached out, gripping the front of his shirt, her nails dragging slightly against the damp fabric, feeling the heat of his body beneath. "No, I'm asking you to trust me." Ethan's breath hitched. For a long moment they stood there, locked in a battle of will and emotion, the past waging war against the undeniable hunger between them. Then, slowly, he reached up, his fingers trailing along her jaw, his thumb brushing over her lips. It wasn't a kiss. It was a warning, a promise. His voice came out low, ragged. "If I fall for you again, Sophia, there's no walking away this time." Sophia swallowed hard, her body already giving him the answer before her lips could. She didn't want to walk away. She wanted to burn with him. Sophia's pulse pounded as Ethan's fingers lingered on her skin, the heat of his touch branding her. His thumb traced the curve of her lips, slow, deliberate, like he was memorizing the way she felt beneath his hands, like he was deciding if he could survive wanting her again. Her breath was uneven, her body still buzzing with the aftermath of their last collision. But this moment wasn't just about desire. It was about trust. And Ethan had every reason not to trust her. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the steady, heavy rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. "Then don't walk away." Ethan's entire body tensed. His jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he was going to push her away. But instead he did the opposite. He pulled her in. His grip on her waist was firm, possessive, fingers spreading over her lower back as he crushed her body to his. Sophia let out a sharp breath as her soft curves met the solid planes of his body, heat sparking between them like a live wire. "You make it sound so easy." His voice was rough, thick with emotion, his breath hot against her cheek. Sophia lifted her chin, challenging him. "It is easy. If you want me, Ethan, then just..." His mouth was on hers before she could finish. The kiss was not gentle. It was hunger and frustration, a war they both wanted to lose. Sophia moaned against his lips as Ethan's hands explored her, sliding up her back, fisting her hair, pulling her deeper into him. She pressed against him, feeling everything. The warmth of his skin, the strength in his grip, the way his body reacted to hers like he had been starving for her all these years. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her nails scraping along the nape of his neck. Ethan let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through her, making her throb between her thighs. His hands traveled lower, gripping her thighs, lifting her effortlessly. Sophia gasped as he pinned her against the nearest wall, his body pressing into hers, making her feel every hard inch of him. Their breath came hot, ragged, bodies grinding together, a slow, torturous friction that left them both desperate. Ethan tore his mouth from hers, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her throat, biting lightly at the sensitive skin there. Sophia's head fell back, her body arching, offering herself to him. Ethan. His name was a breathless plea. His fingers dug into her thighs as he rolled his hips against hers, letting her feel just how much he wanted her. You think you know what you're asking for? His voice was dark, teasing, but there was an edge of restraint as if he was holding himself back from completely devouring her. Sophia reached between them, her fingers trailing along his abdomen, feeling the muscles twitch beneath her touch. She looked into his wild, stormy eyes, a smirk curling on her lips. Why don't you show me? A curse fell from Ethan's lips before he claimed her mouth again, harder this time, more demanding. This wasn't just about lust. It was about everything that had been denied to them for years. The past was burning behind them, and there was no turning back now. Sophia had never been afraid of an audience. She had lived her entire life under scrutiny, headlines dissecting her every move, whispers in boardrooms, cameras flashing like lightning storms. But tonight, the only eyes that mattered were his. Ethan stood before her, rain still dripping from his hair. His shirt opened just enough to reveal the hard lines of his chest. His fists were clenched, his body tense like he was ready for a fight he wasn't sure he wanted to win. The street buzzed around them, cars passing, people watching, but none of it existed to her. Only him, only this moment. She took a step closer, then another, until there was no space left between them. Ethan exhaled sharply, his hands going to his hips like he was bracing himself. What the hell are you doing, Sophia? Her chest rose and fell, her pulse hammering in her ears. I'm choosing you. His breath caught. She saw it. The moment the words sank in, the moment his walls cracked. Sophia hadn't come here to plead. She hadn't come here to apologize for wanting him. She had come here to claim him. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, gripping him, forcing him to feel how real this was. I don't care about the press. I don't care about my father. I don't care what anyone says about us, Ethan. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly against his chest, because this wasn't just a declaration. It was a surrender. To him. To them. Ethan's jaw flexed, his nostrils flaring, as if he was at war with himself. She lifted a hand, her fingers trailing along the stubble on his jaw, down his throat, over the ridge of his collarbone. His skin was hot, his body so tense, and when she pressed her palm against his chest, she felt his heart racing beneath her touch. You said if you fall for me again, there's no walking away. Her voice was a whisper now, her lips inches from his. So fall, Ethan. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his breath hot and ragged, his control hanging by a thread, his eyes burned into hers, hungry, tortured, filled with something deeper than just desire. And then he broke. His hands shot up, cupping her face, his fingers sliding into her hair as he crashed his mouth against hers. The world around them vanished. The street, the people watching, the flashing lights, none of it mattered. It was just heat, breath, friction. Ethan's kiss was desperate, claiming, punishing. His tongue sliding against hers in a way that made her knees weaken. His hands traveled down, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his body, making sure she felt every inch of him. Sophia moaned against his mouth, her fingers gripping his hair, pressing closer, needing more. The rain soaked into their clothes, making the fabric cling to their bodies, making the sensation even more unbearable. Ethan's hands roamed lower, gripping her hips, lifting her slightly, pressing her against the nearest surface. A wall. She didn't care. She just needed him, needed this. Tell me you mean it, he rasped against her lips. Sophia didn't hesitate. Her fingers trailed down his chest, her nails raking over his skin, her lips brushing the corner of his mouth before she whispered, "I've never meant anything more." Ethan let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a sigh of surrender. And then he kissed her. Again, harder, deeper, like a man who finally stopped fighting his own heart. This wasn't just passion. This was everything, and they were never letting go again. Ethan's kiss wasn't gentle. It was a claim, a battle won, a promise sealed with the heat of his mouth crashing against hers. Sophia felt everything in that moment, the years of longing, the anger, the unspoken words, all melting into a kiss that left her breathless, undone, completely his. Her fingers tangled in his damp, unruly hair, nails scraping, pulling, needing him closer. Ethan's hands roamed her body with purpose, fingers gripping, exploring, branding every inch of her like he wanted to make sure she never forgot who she belonged to, and she didn't want to forget. Her body molded against his, her soft curves fitting against the hardness of his muscles, the sharp edges of his frame pressing into her, sending waves of heat and pleasure through her core. She moaned into his mouth, the sound swallowed by his kiss as his hands slid lower, gripping her thighs, lifting her effortlessly. Sophia gasped when her back met the cool surface of his car, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist. Feeling the full weight of him pressing into her, she felt him, thick, hot, so ready for her, and the friction of their bodies moving against each other made her throb with anticipation. Ethan's mouth left hers, trailing wet, hungry kisses down. Her head fell back, her fingers gripping his shoulders, her breathing ragged, each touch sending shockwaves through her body. "You have no idea what you do to me, Sophia." Ethan's voice was low, rough, his lips brushing her ear, making her shiver all over. She arched into him, feeling every inch of his hard body against hers, her heart hammering so fast she thought she might explode. "Then show me, Ethan. Make me feel it." A deep growl rumbled in his chest, his grip on her tightening, his hips pressing harder into hers, making her gasp at the delicious friction. Her nails dug into his back, dragging down, making him shudder. His mouth found hers again, devouring, possessing, claiming, their tongues tangling in a battle of need and desperation. But then, he stopped. Just long enough to look at her, just long enough to breathe her in. His eyes burned with something deeper than lust, something raw, something real, something that had never faded. Sophia's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands still gripping him, refusing to let go. "This is forever, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice shaking from everything she felt. Ethan's fingers caressed her cheek, his touch softer now, his breath warm against her lips. It always was. And then, he kissed her again. But this time, it wasn't about claiming. It was about keeping, because there were no more doubts, no more past, no more what-ifs, only them. And this time, nothing was taking them away from each other again. The scent of grilled food mixed with the salty breeze of the ocean and the soft hum of distant laughter filled the air. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun seep into her skin, feeling the weight of peace settle deep in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She wasn't fighting against expectations. She was just living, a strong pair of arms wrapped around her waist from behind, a familiar heat pressing into her back. Sophia smiled, leaning into the touch, already knowing who it was. "You keep standing there like that, and people are going to start thinking you actually enjoy this quiet life." Ethan's voice was low, teasing, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, making her shiver despite the warmth of the day. She smirked, turning in his arms to face him. God, he looked good. Tanned skin, broad shoulders, that same rough, devastating smile that had always undone her. But now, there was something new in his eyes, something lighter, something that told her he had finally stopped fighting against the happiness they had found. Sophia traced her fingers along his jaw, feeling the faint scruff there, before letting her hand trail lower, across the solid plane of his chest. "And what if I do?" she murmured, tilting her chin up slightly. Ethan's lips twitched, his eyes darkening just a little as he tightened his grip on her waist, pulling her flush against him. "Then I'd say it's about damn time." She laughed, the sound light, effortless, because this was everything. A voice interrupted them before she could reply, a tiny, excited giggle, followed by small feet pattering across the wooden deck. "Daddy!" Ethan turned instantly, a grin breaking across his face as the little girl ran straight into his arms. Her dark curls bounced wildly as Ethan lifted her with ease, pressing a loud kiss to her cheek. Sophia watched them, her heart swelling at the sight, at the life they had built. "You're all dirty from the grill, baby." Sophia playfully brushed her daughter's face, smudging a bit of sauce off her cheek. The little girl giggled, her father's grin mirrored perfectly in her expression. "That's 'cause I'm helping Daddy cook." Ethan winked at Sophia, shifting their daughter higher in his arms. "Told you she had good taste." Sophia rolled her eyes but couldn't stop smiling. Years ago, she had believed happiness came with conditions, that love meant sacrifice, that some things weren't meant to last. But she had been wrong, because real love, the kind that burned, the kind that survived wars, the kind that was worth fighting for, always found a way back. And now, standing there with the two people she loved most in the world, Sophia knew one thing for certain. She had finally found her forever. Some loves never fade. They survive time, distance, and even the wounds of the past. Sophia and Ethan's story wasn't about perfection. It was about fighting for what truly matters. They lost each other once, but fate brought them back together, proving that the right love always finds its way home. And now, I want to know, have you ever felt that kind of connection? That love that, no matter how much time passes, still lingers in your heart? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you,